very easy to find information on Celtic or Gaelic paganism. There are countless books on the subject, hundreds of videos, and individuals offering courses. While there are good scholars on the subject, with a good knowledge of Old or Archaic Irish, who have read the texts and know how to interpret them correctly, unfortunately, there are far more whose knowledge is incorrect. In this video, I want to try to examine Gaelic pagan, or better, pre-Christian beliefs, and try to cut through all the misconceptions about the subject and uncover what we actually know about what people believed in Iron Age Ireland. In particular, I want to look at a few key questions. Was there a Gaelic pantheon, and can we talk of Gaelic gods? What was the function of religion in the period? And were there Druids in Ireland? However, before this, I want to talk of some of the difficulties with the subject of Gaelic paganism. For Neolithic and Bronze Age Ireland, while there are no texts, there are considerable structures and objects that were probably used for religious purposes. This means that we can have an idea of some of the foci of their religious or ritualistic behaviour. For Gaelic or Iron Age Ireland, it is kind of reverse. There are few sites or objects that were specifically religious. Some objects do exist, and it is possible that some stone rows such as Ictor in Kerry may have been used in the Gaelic period. Moreover, there are also a number of sites associated with kingship that were given a new significance in Gaelic culture, such as Tara. Finally, some passage graves and Neolithic sites, especially in Brunaboyne, were either used or regarded as sacred in Gaelic times. However, we have much less information on Gaelic rituals or how they interacted with the supernatural, the other world, with spirits or gods. This may be part of the reason why so many people have made their own reconstructions of Gaelic religion to fill this vacuum. On the other hand, we have a wonderful corpus of texts from Gaelic Ireland. However, there's a major difficulty with these texts. All were produced in the Christian period, often hundreds of years after the end of the previous religion. Many people base their views of Gaelic or Celtic religion on these texts. Moreover, the interpretation of these texts is extremely complicated. Another difficulty is that secondary sources are actually far more popular, meaning that there is a great distance from the source material. Apart from university researchers, very few read the original texts in the language in which they were written. Most use translations. When reading these texts, and when discussing other common beliefs about Gaelic or Celtic Ireland, we have to deal with a series of filters. These filters have a huge influence on our understanding and interpretation. A profound sense of critical skepticism is required for this sort of historical discussion. First is the Roman filter. All the texts were written by monks who would have had a good understanding of the Roman world, including Roman religion, beliefs, their view of barbarians, and literature. For example, in his In Search of the Irish Dreamtime, J.P. Mallory shows that parts of the Donn were influenced by Homer, though in a Latin translation, not the original Greek. Related to this is the second filter. They were also produced in a Christian context. Often stories were modelled on the New or Old Testament. For example, Micheál Macra shows that some parts of Baha Éarua, one of the last examples of Gaelic political literature, were modelled on the Book of Maccabees. Third is the Norman Conquest. This brought a fresh set of prejudices to Ireland. Norman writers, notably Giraldus Cambrensius, were propagandists set on removing Ireland from Europe as such, by making Ireland barbaric and non-Christian in a way. Indeed, Giraldus seems to be the source for the story about St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland and St. Brigid's fire. Although some modern authors seem to use him, he is not a trustworthy author. Continuing with the filters, the next one is language. Irish language has changed considerably over the centuries. It is even divided into different sections: Primitive Irish, Old Irish, Middle Irish, Early Modern Irish, and Modern Irish. Some of these contain further subdivisions. Moreover, according to Mallory, before the 7th century, quote, the Irish language had endured an incredibly brusque change in pronunciation, end quote. He refers to this as the Great Syllable Slaughter, which shortened and changed words. Ogham stones are evidence of this, as they tend to use the older pronunciation. This change, Mallory says, would have impacted the passing down of old stories and myths. Indeed, he shows that this is evident in some of the inconsistencies in some of the first versions of the Donn. Like any language, Irish has changed dramatically over time. This leads to problems of interpretation. To understand and interpret a text written in the 10th century, and to use this text to talk about religious beliefs of 500 years previously, is extremely difficult. Texts have to be interpreted in their context. For most texts from this period, this means an understanding of biblical themes is needed, as this frequently appears. For example, Scotia and the Egyptian part of the Milesian wanderings are inspired by the story of Moses. In addition to changes in the language, changes in context, and the usual difficulties in dealing with ancient documents, the destruction of the Gaelic system after 1603 makes interpreting these texts even more difficult. This is because Gaelic culture was so thoroughly destroyed that reconstructing the frames of reference these sources were made in can often be difficult. For example, as various scholars who have studied the final texts, such as Bushe or the Four Masters have pointed out, these texts heavily use archaisms. Their description of the fighting in the 9 Years' War is misleading, to say the least, based on heroic tropes, and it describes the Gaelic soldiers in an outdated fashion. Fortunately, we have many other sources for this period. However, using texts such as Sandus Cormac, for example, as a source to say that Brigid was a goddess is very problematic. The next three filters are more tricky as they are deeply intertwined. These are Romanticism, Victorian interest in the supernatural and occult, and the late 19th century Gaelic or Celtic revival. These are tricky because, on the one hand, they're responsible for a lot of important things, at least the first and third are. We have to thank these for a renewed interest in the Irish language and Irish history, and the preservation and translation of so many documents. On the other hand, quite a lot of erroneous beliefs about Gaelic culture date from this period, such as the idea that in Samhain the veil between the words is weakened, the common view of Druids, and historically misleading heroic versions of Brian Boru, Gráinne ní Bhealaí, and Red Hugh O'Donnell. Many of the translations of this period were problematic. Moreover, the works of Yeats and Gregory, amongst others, have done much to popularize ideas that would have made little sense to the Gaelic people themselves. From a more scholarly perspective, this period saw the writing of Fraser's Golden Bough and Charles Loomer's Vitae Sanctorum Hiberniae. According to Elvira Johnson, the approach in both these works is similar, an approach, she says, that is outdated, but is common in relation to Brigid, and is also popular among many enthusiasts of the fanciful construction of Gaelic belief. The final filter is modern paganism. This has gained strength over the last 30 years or so. Its influence can be seen in the widespread belief, for example, that Brigid was a pagan goddess before becoming a Christian saint. As Elvira Johnson shows, the evidence for this is minuscule. Basically a few lines in the 10th century Sandus Cormac, the work of Geraldus Cambrensis, and occasional references elsewhere. Not much for someone who is claimed as a major goddess. Moreover, some authors have looked at Gaelic works on St. Brigid and tried to claim some of the miracles attributed to her as evidence of paganism. However, this involves taking these sources completely out of context. They can all be more clearly claimed as Christian, as Elvira Johnson convincingly argues. Brigid's fire, for example, is related to the Pentecostal fire, as early medieval Christians would have recognized. The idea of Brigid as a goddess is quite modern, going back to the late 19th century at the earliest. Maud Gonne seems to have been one of the first responsible for this view of Brigid as a goddess. This has resulted in the very interesting life of St. Brigid being overlooked, which is unfortunate as the evidence for a real Brigid is very convincing, and in many ways she was very radical for Gaelic society in the early medieval period. It is now time to turn to the question of the shape and organisation of Gaelic religion. There is a sort of orthodox view of this, which is, whether intentionally or not, modelled on a traditional view of the Roman pantheon. In this, the Celtic pantheon consists of unchanging and clearly defined gods and goddesses. These include Lugh, the equivalent of Jupiter, Nuada, the Dagda, the Morrigan, Brigid, Manon MacLear, Donn, and Angus and various others. Linked to these are the Tuatha Danann and other figures less commonly seen as gods, such as Queen Maeve or Macha. Other figures can also be added to the list of possible Gaelic gods. On the bad side are Crum and Balor. On the good are Danu and Anya. I think it is important to move away from the idea of a Gaelic pantheon, in other words a fixed hierarchy of unchanging gods. Rather, Gaelic religious structure probably echoed Gaelic political structure and its legal system, and was something dynamic and fragmentary. It would have contained a lot of supernatural beings, such as the Tuatha Danann, perhaps Cuchulainn and others who appear in the Donn. While it's very probable that Lugh and other leaders of Tuatha Danann were supernatural beings of some sort, possibly even gods, were all of the Tuatha Danann? Or did they change over time? Can we even know? In addition, there would also probably have been more local gods of spirit. The Paps of Anu in Kerry may be an example of this. While we have a large documentary corpus which contains evidence of Gaelic religious belief, as I've shown, there are huge difficulties with this corpus. In a way, it is more fruitful to identify themes that appear in the text rather than try and identify gods and goddesses. Some of these themes are obvious: harvest and fertility, necessary for an agricultural society. Rivers are also important. All rivers have female names in Irish, and the Boyne itself is named after or strongly intertwined with Boann, another strong candidate for a goddess. The Morrigan is related to warfare. Finally, there is the question of sovereignty. This is a very important theme. Indeed, O'Hogan devotes an entire chapter to it. In the very dynamic and fragmented Gaelic political system, sovereignty was obviously important. It is no surprise to see this reflected in the religious system. How these supernatural figures were regarded would have been dynamic. Lugh, Cuchulainn, or Maeve, or anyone else may have been seen as a god or godlike at a particular time, but seen as more human at another period. Gaelic literature has a number of cycles: the historical, Fionn McCool the Fianna, Cuchulainn, etc. I've seen people pick figures from these to compose an intricate list of Celtic gods. This can easily be found on a basic internet search. However, this is a mistake. It conflates stories from different periods and with different purposes, and joins them together to produce a shopping list of gods. It is possible that Maeve from the Cuchulainn text was a goddess, but only during a certain period, and only in a certain part of Ireland. Gaelic religion was fragmented and decentralized. Power and religion were intertangled, and would remain so long after Ireland became Christian. While the names of Lugh, etc. are well known, often overlooked are references to sacred trees, sacred wells, and sacred stones. Lachnarí and Tullahogue, where the Dungannon O'Neills were usually inaugurated, is one example of this. Originally a stone, it was eventually turned into a chair, and at one stage there was a grove of sacred trees nearby. However, it was cut down by enemies. Indeed, references to the cutting of sacred trees can be found in the annals on many occasions. It was a common practice for soldiers of one side to burn or cut down sacred trees and destroy sacred sites of their opponents. These sacred stones and trees were, I believe, an important part of Gaelic religious practice. One of the reasons for this is because they are connected with sovereignty, and more importantly, the transfer of sovereignty. Elizabeth Fitzpatrick has done a lot of work on Gaelic inaugurations. A central part of this was the transfer of a white rod, the Slat Tiernas, the rod of lordship. The handing of this rod to the new lord gave him sovereignty over his territory. It thus had some sort of quasi-supernatural role. Something common to the other sacred objects, stones, trees, and perhaps even sacred wells. It is also possible that many of these sacred objects had roots in pre-Christian beliefs. Another aspect connected to religion was what are called liminal spaces, spaces outside the usual routine daily places, somehow away or apart from normal life. An obvious example of these are mountain tops. Many Irish mountains have cairns on top of them. Some of these have been shown to be Neolithic graves, others are newer. Ireland is also dotted with holy mountains. Some are closely connected to Christianity, such as Croagh Patrick, though this may have had a pagan connection before Patrick. Others are not, such as the Paps of Annu. It seems that both early Christians in Ireland and pagans found something special about mountain tops. Islands seem to be another type of liminal space. Especially along the west coast, Ireland's islands contain numerous small early Christian settlements. It is possible that some of these might have contained sites related to earlier religions. I know this is an unprovable hypothesis, yet on Skellig Michael there is a stone in the monk's graveyard which is said to be the grave of one of the sons of Mill. Could it be that the importance of Skellig Michael as a sacred space predates Christianity? Will we ever know? Another type of liminal space can be found in these kingship sites. Tara, Awanmaka, Rathcrowan, Dunolanya and Cashel. These all predate Gaelic culture, but were given a special, almost magical status by the Irish Gaels. They helped confer sovereignty and legitimacy. Even after Ireland became Christian, this power and status remained. I would recommend here listening to the Abarta Heritage podcast, as it has episodes about several of these spaces. I believe that they are possibly the most important sites if we really want to find out about Gaelic religion, since political power and religion dramatically intersect in them. Finally, we'll now turn to the question of the Druids. Here, the question of filters comes into play, as does the question of received knowledge. In the traditional view, Ireland had a lot of Druids. These formed some sort of church or organised religion and were combated and defeated by St. Patrick. Indeed, there is also an urban legend, one that goes without saying is completely false, that the story of St. Patrick and the snakes is a metaphorical account of Patrick massacring the Druids and their followers. Google it and have a laugh. On the other hand, there is no proof that there were Druids in Ireland. This may seem somewhat crazy to say, yet all references to Druids are post-Christian, sometimes hundreds of years later. They all use the Roman category of Druid and apply this to Ireland. In other words, they take a category invented several hundred years previously and apply this to the pre-Christian priests in Ireland. This is problematic and inevitably results in a loss of knowledge and misconceptions. The use of the Roman category of Druid brought with it, whether in the 7th or the 21st century, certain assumptions such as human sacrifice, sickle, magic, power, etc. How many of these apply to Gaelic Ireland? It is possible that there were people in Iron Age Ireland who couldn't be called Druids. They may even have been very similar to Gaulish Druids. But there would also have been some major differences. For example, take the leader of the Milesians, Amergin. He is quite unique as a political, magical, poetic, religious figure. It is interesting that Amergin rarely appears in reconstructions of Celtic or Gaelic religion. This is probably because he is outside the normal patterns that are found in those chosen to be Celtic gods or supernatural beings. As an aside here, I would highly recommend reading the work of Paddy Bushe on Amergin, especially his most recent book, The Amergin Steppe. There is no material evidence for Druids in Ireland, only texts composed when Ireland was long Christianized and used the Druids as a stereotypical pagan figure who had to be fought against and overcome. However, undoubtedly there were people who carried out religious activities in Iron Age Ireland. We do not know what they called themselves. It is possible that at some stage they saw themselves as Druids. It is also possible that they saw themselves as a mix of priests, judges, and poets. We will never know. Nor is there any evidence of a single Druidic school, no holy isle which produced them. Like poets and judges, they were probably trained in different places and had various roles which altered over time. To close this section, it is worth pointing out the danger of automatically assuming a pre-Christian origin for things. Christianity has been in Ireland for around 1500 years, a long period. It has changed considerably during this period, as have people's own beliefs. Sheila and the gigs are regarded by some as a pre-Christian survival. Yet they are not. They are merged in the Christian period, as Ronald Hutton has shown. He also says, in Ireland at least, the Gaelic also emerged during the Christian period. It is also possible that the figure of Crum, one of the baddies of the Gaelic gods, dates from the Christian period. Despite being found in folklore, there does not seem to be any reference to him before the 10th century. Does this mean he was a Christian invention? It is possible. To close, it is interesting to look at the Tuatha Dé Danann. It is widely believed that many of the Tuatha Dé Danann were gods, notably Lugh. Indeed, the Dé Danann were one of the inspirations for Tolkien's elves. They were the people of the goddess Danu and were some kind of supernatural beings. Was Lugh a god? Possibly, but it is also equally likely that his role changed over time. He may have been a god and then become a leader of supernatural beings. Or he could have always been this kind of supernatural beings. In relation to the rest of the Tuatha Dé Danann, some of the leaders could also have been gods. However, this does not mean that they all were. They could also just have been regarded as some type of powerful non-human. The Tuatha Dé Danann are fascinating, and hopefully in the future I will do a video about them. Once again, we are faced with one of the difficulties of history. We have a puzzle missing many of the pieces, and no picture to copy from. Most versions of Gaelic or Celtic gods draw on an idea of gods that is alien to the Gaelic concept. However, we'll never be able to know what this concept actually was. We can make a supposition, based on considerable evidence, that they had numerous gods, but that these would have been different from the Roman or Christian type of god. The Tuatha Dé Danann, Fionn McCool, Cuchulainn are all socially produced in the Gaelic imagination. We have plenty of fragments to work with in our quest to understand them. Unfortunately, over the last 2 centuries especially, these fragments have been seen through a series of complicated lenses. It is perhaps time to return to the original sources, but also acknowledge that we'll never be able to put together a proper picture of the Gaelic gods and religion. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video and this series. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you can, please support it through my Buy Me a Coffee account. Gurav Mahadev.